Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new edition of Euroquestions, the bi-monthly webinar by the Jacques Delors Institute. Today, we have the pleasure to welcome Claire Vicarnais, Research Fellow in EU Energy Policy at the Jacques Delors Institute. In a context of transformation of our energy system from fossil fuel-dominated supply to renewables, energy community emerged as an opportunity to shift toward a more decentralized and inclusive renewable-based energy system. Since 2018, the EU has driven the energy community movement across the continent. The EU legislation explicitly recognized these communities as a driven actor, taking on additional environmental and social responsibilities. But without sufficient public support and an appropriate enabling environment, energy communities might not be able to fully realize their potential to improve social cohesion at a local level, foster inclusiveness, and reduce energy poverty. Then, to what extent is the European Union helping the energy community movement, and to what can it be improved? Before handing the floor to our guest today, I would like to remind you that the Q&A tool is available at the bottom of your screen. Claire, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Lara. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm thrilled to talk to you a bit today about energy communities and how they may contribute to a more just energy system. So I have four main parts in my presentation. I'll first give you some context about the Sun4 project and about the EU framework on energy communities. Then I'll deep dive on the social aspects of energy communities. And finally, I'll present some recommendations. Next slide, please. So for a little bit of context, the Jacques Delors Institute is part of the Sun4All consortium, which is a Horizon 2020 project that grants vulnerable consumers shares in solar energy installation. So the idea is that revenues produced through the generation and selling of renewable energy is used to reduce the energy bills of participants. The scheme is currently being tested by the cities of Almada in Portugal, Barcelona in Spain, Rome in Italy, and by the community of municipalities that is Cœur de Savoie in France. So in this framework, I wrote a report with Camille Depart on energy communities, and I'll be releasing very soon a policy brief on this topic. And this presentation basically highlights the main results from this research. Next slide, please. Moving on to the European framework on energy communities. First of all, a reminder on what energy communities are. They are a way to organize the production, consumption, storage, sharing, and selling of energy in a decentralized manner. In 2018-2019, with the Clean Energy for All Europeans package, the EU introduced energy communities in its legislation with two new concepts that are citizen energy communities and renewable energy communities. However, contrary to more traditional energy actors, energy communities are subject to some specific rules regarding who can participate and make decisions within the community. Very importantly for us and our topic today, energy communities are explicitly asked to provide environmental, economic, and social community benefits rather than financial profits. So in theory, such legal recognition is enabling energy communities to participate and compete in the energy markets on a level playing field. But in practice, integrating these communities in a liberalized market setting when they actually must fulfill additional responsibilities is creating some tension. So, to relieve this tension, the EU is requiring member states to establish enabling framework that would consider energy communities' wider goals and needs. And this is why I believe enabling frameworks can ultimately either make or break the energy community movement in the EU. However, for now, transposition is still quite uneven. Some countries are doing quite well, like Italy or Ireland, but others haven't really begun transposition, like the Czech Republic, and Bulgaria. If you want more details on this, I highly recommend checking out ResCope's transposition tracker. But in general, what we see is that member states are mostly still in the exploratory or exploration phase of energy communities regulation, with a very strong need for assessments, monitoring, and likely fine-tuning of existing policies when they actually exist. Important to note as well is that member states need to include their enabling framework for renewable energy communities in their national energy and climate plans. So something to keep an eye on for the next months. Next slide, please. There have been many developments, of course, at EU level, especially with Fit for 55 and Repower EU. The acceleration of permitting with the revision of the Renewable Energy Directive, as well as the mainstreaming of solar panels on buildings with the proposed revision of the Energy Performance Buildings Directive, can clearly boost renewable energy communities in the EU. While it is not binding, the EU solar strategy was also a very big signal that the EU Commission sent, with an indicative target of setting up renewable energy communities in all municipalities of 10,000 inhabitants or more, and this by 2025, so a huge goal. The strategy also announced the creation of the Energy Communities Facility at EU level, so some dedicated funding for energy communities. And I really wanted to point out as well that under the new EU rules on state aid, member states can exempt renewable energy communities from mandatory bidding processes. They can also design special tenders, for instance, tenders that would account for the social and democratic benefits of a project. So this is a very positive step. At the same time, the new proposed gas market rules are causing a little bit of a worry, as it could favor non-renewable gas, and it could also lead to big players taking advantage of the citizen energy community framework to the detriment of actual citizens and more local or smaller players. Again, something to monitor very closely. Next slide, please. I wanted to say that the EU is not only supporting energy communities through its legislation, but also through financial and technical support. So there are many funds that these projects could take advantage of, like the Recovery and Resilience Facility, cohesion funds, etc. But in practice, the practice is very different. And the fact that there is very little earmarking of EU funds at national level, especially for energy communities, is actually making it quite difficult for them to access those funds, whether they lack the technical or human expertise or because there are so many competing priorities. And when member states actually do design dedicating funding programs for the energy communities, the amounts can seem a little low, let's say, or limited, compared to the potential that energy communities have, either to unlock private capital or to generate local revenues. In addition, the EU is providing technical supports to both energy communities directly, as well as to local and national governments. So I put some initiatives here. Please feel free to check them out in more detail. Next slide, please. So now I don't want to take some more time on the EU framework, and I would like to deep dive a bit on the social role of energy communities. Today, actually, energy communities are quite struggling to reach the most vulnerable households. Fact is that members of energy communities tend to be quite a homogeneous group. So often older, retired men with higher income or education background. We also observe high membership fees, which are a clear obstacle for low-income households, as well as the fact that the prices offered are not always lower than market prices, which doesn't really incentivize these groups. In addition, very few energy communities are specifically addressing energy poverty or underrepresented groups. And this is generally linked to the size of the community. So the bigger the community, the more resources they have, the more likely they are to engage in these activities. It also depends on to what extent these communities cooperate with local actors, local authorities, and associations. And finally, it depends on the level of awareness, because lack of diversity can create a lack of understanding of other people's needs, and in the end, measures that are not suited. Next slide, please. So I've just talked a bit about the reality of this kind of social role for energy communities. Now in the EU legislation, I said the social role is explicitly mentioned, but at the same time, what we put behind the word social remains to be a bit clarified. Is it just about inclusiveness? But is it also about redistributing profits, increasing acceptability? So it's like more of an open question I wanted to raise. And if providing clarity is important, mostly what energy community needs is actually support. Because many projects just do not have the resources to offer lower fees or engage in energy justice activities. So this is where the enabling framework comes into play, and some good practice actually exists. For instance, in Italy, tenders for energy communities integrate a range of social criteria. And my last point on this topic is that we should be very careful not to overstate the social role of energy communities, especially when it comes to reducing energy poverty. I mean, they can obviously help and contribute, and we need to support them, but we need to make sure that efforts remain structural, so at state level, and that it doesn't become an individual or household level issue in the eyes of decision makers. Next slide. So considering all this, I've drawn up several recommendations, and some of them I'll present today. So in terms of legislation, of course, the EU should pursue its efforts to help energy communities develop. They should also encourage member states to assess clearly the barriers that energy communities face, to include low-income households. There is also some potential, for instance, to adapt or create new green public procurement rules so that municipalities can participate more easily in energy community initiatives. But I think that implementation represents the bulk of the problem. It is very important that the European Commission closely monitors implementation of provision on energy communities, and that it really encourages member states to incentivize or support, or both, communities that actively engage in energy justice activities. And they obviously need to report on this. Next slide, please. Technical assistance, of course, is crucial, and the EU should continue doing so. And it should also foster one-stop shops for energy communities in member states. And finally, on funding, probably the biggest task along implementation, the EU should push member states into using the REPowerEU chapters in their national recovery and resilience plans to either earmark or increase funding for the development of energy communities. Poland, for instance, has foreseen to double funds to energy communities in this framework. So it's actually a good example here. I would also recommend to condition any future dedicated funding at EU level, for instance, the future energy communities facility, to the redistribution of social and local benefits. Of course, this should be done according to a set of criteria, like, for instance, the number of low-income households, or the number of local associations or businesses that are involved in the community, the share of profits or of energy savings that is being distributing within the community or the wider local community. The EU could also offer member states some guidance when it comes to developing calls for tenders that include social criteria, like the example of Italy that I gave earlier. For instance, this could foresee reducing membership fees for low-income groups, collaborating with social housing providers or local social services. So here we are. I focus mostly on EU level recommendations. Of course, there is a lot to be said at national and local level as well. But the policy brief, as I said, will be out shortly. We'll be sure to send it to you. In the meantime, if you have any question whatsoever, I am more than happy to answer them. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Clavier, for your presentation. As you mentioned, EU energy communities are going to be a key actor for the green transition in the European Union. So we received a few questions. Maybe a first one, what are the main barriers to the participation of the lower income people in the energy community? You've just mentioned it in the end of your presentation.
Yes, no, thank you. I've touched a bit upon that, but I think it's good to be clear. Of course, high membership fees is a great obstacle because they don't have the capital or investment capacity to pay them, especially if then the prices are not really lower than market prices. So this is one big one. The second one I also mentioned, but I want to reiterate, is a lack of awareness. Just an example. This is from a study from Hanke, and he conducted a survey, a pan-European survey, and basically the people who were taking decision in the energy community considered in some cases that 500 euros or even 2,000 euros was actually quite affordable for people. So this is quite different from the reality of some people who cannot afford to pay even 500 or 100 euros to join a community. So awareness is very important, and something I did not mention, but I think I should, and I didn't mention it because it was more a national issue, and this was more a presentation on the EU level. But sometimes at national level, tax laws and social welfare rules can impact people's decision to join or set up an energy community. For instance, they can end up losing tax or social benefits due to the installation of a generation plant, or if they own assets, so if they own like share in an energy community. So one of the recommendations that I would say is that member states should make sure that they exempt ownership in an energy community from the application process for any kind of social transfer. So this is very important, actually. So that's it.
Thank you, Clavier. Maybe a follow-up question on that. What is the main obstacle to the development of energy community in the EU member states? Why is it taking so much time?
No, thank you for the question. I mean, of course, we could say gap in the legislation because this is the case for some member states, but actually what I would rather say is implementation. So when there is, regulation that exists, or legislation, sorry, in the end, implementation is very crucial because what we see is that energy communities, often are lacking the proper procedures just to be able to, activate their self-consumption points, just to be able to get the authorization to share energy, to be licensed, etc. So sometimes the procedures, even if theoretically, in the legislation, very naive of me, I thought everything is right. And then when you talk to people on the ground, I did as part of the Central projects, you see that actually it's much more complicated. Also, sometimes distribution system operators, utilities, and licensing bodies are making it quite difficult for energy communities to begin their operation. So the idea is to also increase cooperation with these actors and to make sure that there are the proper communication channels as well. I would also want to add that sometimes there are rules for individual self-consumption. So if you have a solar panel on your roof and you consume it for yourself and you just sell the rest of the energy to the grid, but these rules often do not apply to the more collective self-consumption or to energy communities.
Thank you. On that subject, are there any energy community everywhere in the European Union? You mentioned several countries in the beginning, but isn't something that's going to be not improved, but maybe growing across the continent?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. Actually, that's a great question because geographical distribution is quite uneven. I mean, we see most energy communities in Western and Northern Europe. So Germany a lot, the Netherlands, Denmark, and also if you take into account the population, I think it was also Ireland, Luxembourg, and Estonia that also had quite a lot. And I mean, it comes from the fact that sometimes some countries already had a big history with cooperatives or traditions, and therefore had some favorable, regulation for these types of communities. For instance, I think Denmark offered, grants for individual and cooperatives as far back as the late 70s. And I also believe that they introduced a mandatory 20% ownership share for people living close to new wind installation a few years back as well. So, they already kind of had this tradition and also the regulation that came with it. If you take the southern states, sorry, I'll just go very quickly, but I think I want to give an overview. The southern states, there was a big centralization, and now they're just catching up. But actually, with the potential of solar energy, I think there is some momentum there. And I think for the eastern countries, Central and Eastern Europe, there are very few communities. And sometimes it comes from the fact that in post-communist countries like Bulgaria, citizen-led initiatives can still evoke kind of memories of forced collectivization. So it's a bit of a sensitive topic, and I'm just saying that, but there are also the fact that sometimes households have very low disposable income, like in Bulgaria, so there is very little space for community investment. So here you have a very big overview with some categories of countries.
Thank you, Kirby. Maybe another question. What is the difference between citizen energy communities and renewable energy communities? If you could expand a bit on that.
Yes, that's something that I've been asked quite a few times. So I think the main difference is the energy source and technology. Renewable energy communities, like their name actually indicates, they operate on renewable energy-based heating and electricity, while citizen energy communities, they are also allowed to operate on non-renewable energy sources. And for now, they're only allowed on the electricity sector, but that might change, as I said before. They also have different rules on governance, participation, who can participate, who can make decisions. I won't go into detail, but for instance, anyone can participate in a citizen energy community, but for the renewable energy communities, large company cannot participate in them. And I think the biggest difference as well is the proximity factor. So basically, people who make decisions within a renewable energy community, they have to live next to the project. And it's not the case for citizen energy communities. So you have stricter rules on governance, participation for renewable energy communities. And this is why the enabling framework that the EU is kind of asking for is also a bit more comprehensive for these communities because they have more obligations.
Thank you, Clavi. And just maybe a precision, can energy community help people with renovation, or it's just renewable installation?
No, actually, I should also perhaps have mentioned that. But yes, other services include energy efficiency and the charging of electric vehicles. And actually, in the new proposed revision of the EPBD directive, energy communities are recognized as a kind of actor in the renovation process. So, for instance, they have member states have to include the policies that they have implemented to promote citizen-led and energy community-led renovation programs. Also, last April, something quite interesting is that the European Commission launched a new technical assistance program that was called, I believe, citizen-led renovation to support energy communities in delivering these types of renovation. So it's quite small scale, let's say, for now, but it's still a very good signal. If you want to know more about citizen-led renovation, there is a good example, which is l'essai de vent, which creates a chain of solidarity to help renovating house. So just one concrete example as well of energy community.
Thank you, Claire. And maybe one last question on the topic that we at the Jacques Delors Institute already covered, but still it's important, it's the energy poverty. Do you have any example of energy community that actually help to fight energy poverty in the EU?
Yes, well, if I may do some advertisement, of course, Sun4All is one of them, but I mean, I'll talk about others. In France, there is one that's quite well known, which is called Enercoop, and perhaps some of you are familiar with it. And what they did is that they set up a system of micro donations. So basically, any customer of the cooperative can opt to round up their bill so that they provide support to local energy poverty mitigation programs. So they're not reinventing the wheels. And I think that's quite smart. They're setting up this micro donation program and giving this money back, so redistributing this money. In Greece as well, I think there was like a big movement of energy communities that was trying to be very inclusive. I think in Crete, there is one that is currently being created and that wants to provide free electricity for people in a region that was affected by an earthquake. So there are actually many, many examples of energy communities that do that. What I did in my presentation is that I tried to do like more big picture, and that's even though many are trying, they still need to be supported so that it's more mainstream.
Well, thank you, Claire, for your presentation, and we look forward to read your work with Sun4All project. Thank you, everyone, for following today's Euroquestion. We will send to you the replay later this afternoon. The next session of the Euroquestion will be held on Wednesday, 11th October with Lukas Maciek. He will look with us at the public election in Slovakia and Poland and their impact on the European Union. Please note that this webinar will be held in French. Thank you again, Claire, for your presentation, and thank you everyone for your time. See you in 2 weeks.
Thank you so much.